We are so excited to be hosting this Facebook Live session about the really important topic of pay equity. My name is Ann Warner. I am the CEO of WREN, the Women's Rights and Empowerment Network. My pronouns are she, and I am so delighted to be welcoming Sheila Willis to join me in this conversation today. I'm going to ask Sheila to go ahead and introduce herself.
Hey everyone, my name is Sheila Willis and I'm an employment attorney at Fisher & Phillips. I'm excited to be with you all today. My pronouns are she, her, and hers.
Fantastic, Sheila. We are so lucky to have you. You are an expert on employment law and all things pay equity. The reason that we're having this discussion today is because this is the week that we recognize Equal Pay Day. And what Equal Pay Day means is it's tomorrow, actually, March 24th, and this is recognized nationally. So it represents how far into 2021 that the average woman would have to work to earn what the average man had earned at the end of 2020. So another way of saying that is that the average woman will have to work about an extra 3 months to earn what a man had made. So we recognize this nationally to call attention to the fact that the pay gap, the gender pay gap, and also as it intersects with other important variables like race, is still a huge and important issue here in South Carolina and around the country. WREN calls attention to this day every year. And WREN, for those of you who don't know, we are a statewide, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization with a mission to build a movement to advance the health, economic well-being, and rights of women, girls, and their families in South Carolina. And this is a really crucial issue. It's a crucial issue when it comes to all aspects of the health and well-being of women and gender expansive folks and their families in our state. Before we get started with the conversation, I want to make sure that people know some of the stats. You probably have heard them, and hopefully you're seeing them on WREN social media channels this week. But it's important to know that we've been talking about pay equity for decades, and the pay gap has barely budged in the last 20 years or so. And South Carolina has one of the worst gaps in the country. So it's really important for us to acknowledge that this is an issue across the nation, but it's a particularly big issue here in South Carolina. So the most recent stats tell us that here in South Carolina, women working full-time earn about 77 cents on the dollar compared to men working full-time in South Carolina. When you add race, these disparities are magnified. So Latina women are paid 53.9 cents to every dollar paid to a white non-Hispanic man. Black women are paid 57 cents compared to every dollar earned by non-Hispanic white men. Native women are paid 60.9 cents to every dollar paid to a white non-Hispanic man. And Asian women are typically paid 71.7 cents for every dollar paid to a white non-Hispanic man. That wage gap is substantially larger for some subgroups of Asian women. So we've heard these stats. We've been hearing them for a long time. Sheila, tell us, why do you think we're still talking about the pay gap? How do you see this showing up in your work?
Thanks, Ann. Before I get started, I do want to shout out the South Carolina Women Lawyers Association, who's also been a really great supporter. And you don't really celebrate Equal Pay Day. I guess you recognize it, Equal Pay Day through the years as well. But it has persisted, and there's been a couple of different reasons why you see pay inequities. And I do employment law, and I represent companies, and so I know that people think that there's some person behind the curtain like, ooh, we're just going to pay women less, like that's the plan, we're just going to do that. But that's not always the case, and I would say that that's not always the case, or the vast majority of time that isn't the case. But I will say there are some historical foundations in that, right? So when women first started entering into the workforce, there was this thought that women need to be paid less because they're not the breadwinners. We're not paying women to take care of households. We're paying them for, shopping money or money to get their hair done or money to get their nails done, or they're supplementing the income. So there was that initial thought process that has kind of seemingly permeated throughout. So we started out on an unequal footing in the very, very beginning. There's also some sociological issues that go into that. There's, rewards when you think about getting a job or negotiating salaries. Studies have shown that women are not necessarily going to try and negotiate salaries or ask for higher bumps when it's time for a promotion. There's also implicit bias factors with women and also minority stereotypes. If you think about different perceptions that folks have about different minorities, oh, that's cheap labor, that's someone we don't necessarily have to pay, those things layer on, and you have an intersection where minority folks, stereotypes, whatever that bias is, plays into that. And then what I see with the vast majority of my clients is that employers just don't necessarily think that there's something wrong with their system. Like when I go into doing pay equity audits, and we'll talk about that, a lot of times in that initial phone call, the companies that's not who we are. We are an equal employment opportunity employer. We want to give everyone a fair shake. We want to pay people equally. We have these systems in place, but they've not done that extra step of studying it to see what it looks like, looking at different systems. So I'll give you some examples. I had a client once that they had gotten a complaint where they said that there was a manager that was favoring Hispanic employees over Black employees. And so, I'm going to investigate the complaint and, talking to the person who made the complaint, and they said, well, the Hispanic employees get all the overtime. And it's never given out to anyone else. And so I'm looking and I'm talking to the manager. Okay, well, how do you allocate overtime? Is it a sign-up sheet? Is there a process that you have in place? Because that's the giving of overtime in and of itself is not something that's legally mandated. You just have certain obligations into how you pay it. So we find out that in this employer system that the manager has the discretion in awarding overtime. And so in talking to that manager, they said, well, I've given it to my hardest workers. My workers that work the hardest, that help me get the best numbers, they're the people that I offer the overtime to first. And if they can't make it, then I give it to someone else. It just so happened that all of the people that this manager thought were their hardest workers happened to be Hispanic. That was not something that factored in to that decision process, but that was where there was a breakdown in a process that was resulting in equity that no one was thinking was. Like from a bird's eye view, you're not looking at that thinking, oh, okay, well, this could be an opportunity where there could be a pay inequity or an opportunity inequity. But in practice, that's what it actually looked like. I've also seen examples where we're looking at pay and there are employers where maybe they have values on different things, where maybe their system says, well, if someone has a bachelor's degree or a master's degree or a PhD, they get these pay bumps in what we're looking at in that initial discussion. Well, if you were just looking at that, let's say I have a PhD in basket weaving and you've hired me to build cars, right? That's not relevant to my job. That's not relevant to what you're hiring me for. So maybe giving someone that bump for that doesn't make any sense. And so looking at how you're valuing things and making sure that they are refined to what the approach is has been a newer focus, I think, when we're looking at pay equity, because a lot of these scenarios and situations have come about from completely different things that happen. Other things that I've seen is some employers will say, okay, we're great. We have ranges. This particular job has this salary range. It's $13 an hour to $18 an hour. Everyone knows that it's fine. Well, the managers have discretion. Have you trained the managers on what that discretion looks like? Do you have criteria that says this is what $13 work looks like? This is actually what $18 work looks like. This is the experience level that we're looking for. This is the time and role that we're looking for. So having those particular parameters, so looking at it kind of comprehensively, and we'll talk about this more, but sometimes, again, it's I want to say flaws in the system, but there are unintended loopholes or unintended gaps that can create the pay gap when you're looking at a compensation system that can help, or not help, but can foster these continued pay inequities. And maybe there are probably bad actors out there that are like, ooh, I want to do that. But I've not really seen that and not really run across that in my practice.
Okay, that's really helpful. I want to welcome folks who are just joining to this Facebook Live discussion with Sheila Willis. If you have questions, please feel free to put them in the comments. We will do our best to get to them. And if we can't get to them, we'll try and follow up with you later. We are having a great conversation, and I have so many questions for Sheila. So I'm going to keep asking a few, but y'all please do pop in and let us know what your questions are. So you've just you really kind of laid out for us some of the things that show up when you're running a workplace, when you've got humans who are making complex decisions and have their own subjective points of view that they're using to make decisions. Could you tell us more about what the current law in South Carolina says about pay equity? Break it down for us, if you would.
So South Carolina borrows heavily from the equal pay law. And so it generally it's going to require equal pay for equal work. And that pay, when you're talking about pay, it's defined as your salary. It looks at overtime, bonuses, different stock options, profit sharing, vacation pay, holiday pay, reimbursements, all those things that could be in pay. And so when we're looking at it, South Carolina, again, borrows very heavily from the federal perspective. And so when we're looking at it on a legal basis, when I get a case in and if there's been an allegation of pay inequities, what I'm looking at is to see if the person who's alleging the pay inequity is in a protected class. Are they woman? Are they in whatever the protected class is? And are they as qualified as the employee in the non-protected class? Because these are going to require a comparator. You've got to say, hey, there's somebody else that's being treated differently than me, that's being treated more favorably than me, and I am as qualified, I am doing the same job, or I'm doing something similar, but I'm being paid less than that person. And so those are going to be very factual inquiries when we get into that, of looking at, are you as qualified? Because I've seen cases where someone has said, well, I should be making more. There's a white male here that's making a lot of money. Well, maybe he has more qualifications, right? And then they're relevant qualifications, not that he has a PhD in basket weaving, but they're relevant qualifications. So maybe, you might have an associate's degree in chemistry, and this person might have a bachelor's degree in chemistry, and they have been a manager for longer. Like, those types of nuances are things that are going to be looked at. And often when you are in a work center as an employee, and I will tell you, I have been an employee before. I have, worked at a Sonic drive-in. I've managed a big box retailer. I get it. So I know those things. But when you're an employee and you're in the trenches, you're just looking over, well, why do they make more? Right? You may not be able to think and see through, maybe there is something. And that's also tough sometimes because it requires some introspection on your part too. But looking at, are we doing the same types of work? Are we similarly qualified? And is there a reason that we're being paid differently? And if it's not, if it's based on the fact that I'm a woman, or that I'm a Black woman, or that I have a disability, then we've got something different to talk about.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So we've talked a little bit about what the current law in South Carolina requires for employers. And I know there's a lot more nuance to it than you're able to get into on this brief conversation. But I'd love to hear more of your reflections on what a lot of other states are doing. They have enacted more comprehensive pay equity laws. In South Carolina, we have some draft legislation that's been introduced and has been discussed. We hope will be discussed in this legislative session. But I'd love to hear you talk about some of the aspects of those laws that have been enacted in various places, and what some of the tenets of those laws are that and how they're designed to actually impact the pay gap.
Oh, absolutely. So this is a chance where I will take a second to plug my law firm has a pay equity map. I believe they're going to drop it in the comments, but if you want to know what pay equity stands in different states, we have an interactive map. You can just hover over a state and you can find out a ton of different information. But Anna's absolutely right. A lot of states are enacting pay equity laws that have a little more teeth than the federal law because they have several different requirements, and the requirements are actually the legal nerd in me is really fascinated by them, and I hope I can make them fascinating for you. Because it really goes to hit some very interesting aspects of pay equity. So one of the primary things that you see in all these laws that are being enacted are salary history bans, and that is bans on asking a prior salary history. So if you filled out an application before, you may have seen where someone asked you what your rate of pay was at a previous job, or you know, and you go through it and you have this list of things that are there. And so one of the things that is designed to prohibit is one of the first ones, it helps make sure that you aren't bringing in pay inequities that may have been from another employer, right? So maybe that employer was paying someone really less, and you're just like, oh, well, I'm just going to bring you in, and I see that you're making, we'll see $35,000. You're making that fits in my range. We can do that. And then we're fine. But we may have taken that on knowing that, you know, maybe the average salary for that role is maybe $45,000 based on studies, and we can talk about that. So another thing, though, that is really interesting that comes up in pay equity, and I hope I tried to come up with an example to illustrate this, and this is in no way to just diminish it, but I do want you to kind of think through this process. So let's say we have $10 and we want to buy a notebook. And we look at this notebook and the notebook is $9, right? And then we see this exact same notebook at another store and it's $7. We're likely going to buy the notebook that's $7, right? There's nothing wrong with the $9 one, but that $7 notebook puts more money in our pocket. So that's what we're thinking about. Oftentimes, we have hiring managers, or we're looking at when we're putting together what the offer is going to be. If we have our salary history, let's say for this particular job, our budget for the job is $50,000. We get an application in and it says, okay, this person was making $35,000. I could offer them $5,000 more. That's a benefit for them. They're going to think, ooh, I'm getting a raise. And then I still saved $10,000 in my budget by getting this person in at $40,000, right? So we have been good for the bottom line. We've been good for the employee coming in because we've given them a raise, but that may not be equitable when we compare it to everything else, right? But we've looked at it in a vacuum. So in that vacuum, this is a win. But then I filter this person into the workforce, and maybe that $40,000 is not equitable. Maybe that's the lowest rate. Heck, maybe it's the highest rate, right? So when you think about like those subjective decisions that happen, sometimes they're in a vacuum. And so one of the reasons of getting salary history bans is to kind of do away with that. Another thing that some of the laws have are a prohibition on discussing salary. If you've worked places, you know that a lot of times we don't talk about it. And if you're a federal contractor, you cannot ban that. And in some places, some people do talk about that. And the reason that employers, or the reason behind pulling back on salary discussions or saying you can't prohibit people from talking about that, so that other people know what's going on, right? If I am making my widgets, right, and the person next to me is making the exact same widgets and we're working the exact same hours, and that person's making $3 more, if we don't ever talk about it, I'm never going to know about it, right? And so that's what that aspect is. Another one that we've seen is posting salary ranges. So whether it's for a new hire position or for promotion, because again, you don't know what you don't know. So if you're going in to apply for a job, again, let's say I'm this person that, you know, I was making $35,000, they're going to offer me $40,000. If I can see on the posting that the range really is up to $50,000, then I have some negotiation room, and I can go back to, hey, you know, I really would love to work here. I understand that the range for this position is $50,000. I think that my qualifications and my experience merit this amount, right? So that I know that there's more wiggle room. But if I didn't know that, if I didn't have that information, I might be super excited and say, oh, great, got my 40,000, I've gotten my raise, and this is wonderful for me. So this is where, again, the laws are doing that. Now, I will say the laws have some exceptions and some safe harbors for employers. So some exceptions they might have is if you have, a pay system that rewards seniority. So someone that's been there longer is going to make more money. That's going to be something that generally is okay. If you have a system that factors in geography, right? So the cost of living in Los Angeles and New York looks way different from Columbia, South Carolina. So if I have widget maker in South Carolina and widget maker in California, I can say widget maker in California maybe makes more because it costs more to live in whatever particular part of California. And usually that's defensible. Other things, if there's a union in place and a collective bargaining agreement sets whatever those rates are, then we're not going to go against that. So that's some exceptions. And then, and I know we'll spend some time talking about doing pay audits, but a lot of the laws have safe harbor provisions in them, which allows that if the employer conducts a pay audit within a certain amount of time, if they conduct it, or if they conduct it and they see problems and they are proactively trying to fix them, then they can have, a defense to the action. They may be able to get out of some of the damages. So the laws are kind of fulsome in their approach to attack various things that may impact pay and equity. So I hope I didn't nerd out too much on that.
That was just nerdy enough.
Good.
I want to bring up a question that somebody had because it's related to what you were talking about. Somebody in the Facebook chat asked, under the law, and I think they mean under the current law in South Carolina, can employees compare salaries on the job? And I assume they mean by that, can I talk to somebody else within my workplace about what I'm making? Is that allowed under the law in South Carolina?
So generally, yes. And I hate to do the lawyer, it depends, but sometimes it may depend, but generally there's not a prohibition on that. Now, I will say if you have, I'm trying to think of a random example. Maybe there's, you are working on a contract and the contract portions are confidential, and maybe your coworker's working on a different contract that's confidential. And I mean, there's nuances of that. So the answer would be, it depends, but I would say generally, you could talk about it.
Okay, great. And you just, in your previous answer to my question, you talked about proactive steps that employers can make. And I think that's a really important conversation. And I'd like to hear more from you about not only what must employers do to comply with the law that's on the books in their state, but why are some employers taking more proactive steps to address pay gaps? And what are some of those steps that you've seen employers take?
Well, so I think the whole discussion about pay, and I see my camera's falling. I'm going to adjust this. Sorry, it's just falling. I think that the whole discussion about pay inequities and the fact that they're not getting better is really making a lot of employers look in-house. If for no other reason than they want to assure themselves that they're doing the right thing, right? Because we can say we're doing the right thing, but if we don't have kind of the backup, if you will, then we aren't sure. And that's the thing where I said, if you're looking at things in a vacuum, you're not going to necessarily see the full picture. So in all those examples, like I said, if we're looking at that one person, great and wonderful, but once we feather that person into our whole workforce, what does that look like? And so conducting pay audits, that use different variables. And when I say pay audits, I don't mean just looking at it and saying, okay, all these people make this, it's in the salary range, good, let's move on. I mean, looking at pay audits that have some type of statistical approach to them. And when I say statistical approach, typically what we do when we help employers conduct pay audits is they will have an analysis, and going back to your high school math classes that I never thought I would use, but somehow still using them as a lawyer, but factoring in different variables like date of hire, date and position, race, gender, age, anything else that the employer may be using as a variable in compensation to see how it impacts different different job groups or different genders, different protected classes, whatever you're looking at. I would also encourage employers to look at whatever your legislation covers, right? So some states have a wide variety of protected classes. Like some protect married people, some protect LGBTQ people. And so if you have those types of protections, you also need to be looking at that. Now, the interesting thing that comes into this, that's one of the more unique things that I get from employers, is that to look at this information, you have to know it. But as a, one of the things that is very, very pronounced in things that we talk about is when we're talking about equal employment opportunity, we're not looking at those. We're not supposed to take in those factors. And so when I sit down with an employer and I say, okay, well, we need to divide everyone up by race because we need to look at this. We need to talk about gender. We need to figure out if you have non-binary employees, where that category fits, how we're going to do that. You know, the first thing is like, oof, I don't want to do that. We're not supposed to do that, right? And so that is also part of it, is people are like, well, if I'm not supposed to take this into account, I don't want to know the information. I'm by golly not going to take it into account. But for this, you got to do it. You kind of got to know those things. So getting over that unique, I don't know, that unique feeling of not wanting to know that information, because that's one of the tenets. We're not supposed to treat people differently, but you have to know that information to do that, which is also why when you're conducting pay audits, the circle is small, because you don't want, you know, all of that information out where it could be used in an inappropriate way. The other thing employers can do is doing their pay research, looking at different jobs in the market, what the market looks like. A lot of employers will have a pay strategy where you can, you know, there's third-party companies that keep databases of salaries, and you can say, you know, our compensation philosophy is we are, you know, in the middle for the market, or we're 2% above market, or we're 3% below market, whatever the factor is, and then they model their policies by that. So they can always say, you know, we're, you know, our plan here is to be 2% below what the market is because the market here is crazy and we can't afford that, or whatever the case may be, and looking at that. And then the other thing is looking at your compensation systems holistically. What is your whole incentive system? Because another thing that you'll see with pay inequities is people will, we may get the hiring part right, we get you in the door right, but we don't have a promotion system that is really tailored to what we need. We don't have any particular guidelines on how to do that. You know, there's just discretion. We've got a budget, we'll just give it out and we'll just see where the chips lie, and we're not looking at that. Or there may be, you know, different other opportunities for compensation, whether it's, you know, we give vacation time differently, or we reimburse things differently. Looking at the whole compensation, because it's not always just your base salary that factors into your pay, if you will. So those are just some examples. And I will say, from kind of an enforcement standpoint, I know the EEOC and then its sister organization, OFCCP, which is the Office of Federal Contractor Compliance, that enforces the laws with regard to federal contractors. They're really focusing on promotions and what that looks like as kind of the next wave of trying to fight the pay inequity and the pay gap.
That's so helpful. So what I'm hearing you say is it really takes some effort to focus on being more consistent and more transparent about how decisions are made, about how resources are distributed among employees, and that there's a lot that employers can do to make sure that their frameworks and those processes are clear, and so that there's not a lot of uncertainty or speculation about how those decisions are made.
Absolutely. And that's definitely something where you want to make sure you are partnering with your appropriate people, whether it's in-house counsel, outside legal counsel, have your HR folks involved, you know, your managers. That needs to be a full kind of discussion about how we're going to approach it with all the various stakeholders, because the thing that's very important to people is their pay. right? That is one of the number one things. When I was a manager, like if someone's paycheck was 20 cents off, they knew it. If it was 17 cents off, they knew it, right? Pay is very, very important. So it's very important critically that you have a approach to it, that you're thoughtful, that you know what you're going to do, from the beginning to the end, as you're looking at, if you're an employer looking at kind of overhauling what your compensation system looks like.
Great. We have a question from one of our participants asking if you could expand a bit more on posting wages when it comes to job openings. Can you say a little bit more about the rationale behind that and why that really is a trend among employers? And it's certainly something WREN does as a standard protocol. When we put out job postings, we always list a range for the salary. Why are more and more employers moving in that direction?
Well, so it's a little bit of both things. One, they may be in a state that requires them to do it. So it's for a law. And I will tell you, South Carolina is not a state that requires that. So if you're thinking, oh, I've seen job postings, they don't have it. South Carolina is not a state that requires that. The federal law doesn't require that, but some states are starting to do that. The other reason is for that transparency piece, so that you can see what the range is. That also helps if the range is something that you would never work with. If you are looking and you're like, oh, this is a really cool job, and then you get through the process and you get an interview, and then in the interview they're like, oh yeah, no, this job, the max we could pay for this job is X amount of money, and you're like, oh, I don't want to do that. Like, you wouldn't have wasted your time to apply in the first place. So it saves time on that aspect too, but it really provides anyone looking at it, a job seeker, to see the range. The other thing it might do is if you are a current employee and you see that range and it's for your same job, and you might be like, well, what's going on here? Right? Why is this? It says this is this range. And that may be something where, again, someone may not have known that that was the case, right? That may not have known that maybe you were at the lower end of the range, or whatever. And it may be something where there's a completely non-threatening, non-terrible reason why that's there, but that's a discussion that you can have. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's one of the reasons why they'll post wages onto job openings, as well as promotional opportunities too.
Right. It's something that I see more and more, that certain job boards are requiring that information. So even if it's not legally required in your state, if you want to get on, be circulated among some job board, they're going to look and see if you're posting the salary range. And if you're not, then they're not going to share it with their networks. So it's definitely something that is, I think it's picking up steam for lots of good reasons, as you said, both for giving the job seeker more information that can help them know if it's a good fit for them, and also for the employer, so you don't waste a lot of time and get to that final step and then realize that it is not a fit, because we know that recruiting and hiring is resource intensive and takes a lot out of everybody's time, and so if we can be more efficient and clear from the start, I think it works out better for everyone.
Absolutely.
I'd love to know if how you're seeing, as more of your clients and people in your network are taking on some of these new practices, whether because they're required to do so by the law, or because they're choosing to do so because they see it's the right thing to do, the smart thing to do. What are some of the results that you're seeing for the employers that you work with?
So, on the front end of that, if they're identifying, pay equity issues, they're putting steps in place to fix them. If they don't have pay equity issues, then they feel like good, like we are good, we're doing what's right. The other thing is it reduces some of the kind of headache around pay, if you will. Like, clients that have a very systematic process, they know, okay, it's performance review time. If you get this rate, this is your rate, this is the increase you get, and we're good. Now, I will say the other kind of the slight downside to having a really regimented system is there is not room for subjectivity, right? If you wanted to reward someone for going above and beyond, then you may not be able to do that because it may not fit into a bucket within the system. So I don't really see that a ton, but that is something that is there because, again, pay is incentive. Pay is thank you for doing a good job. I want to show you that you are valued. And so if you are very, very strict in how you can show someone they're valued, that can have some unintended consequences. But generally, it provides more reliability on both ends, both the employee and the employer. And it kind of cuts down on any type of concerns, right? If you can point to a policy and say, hey, this is what our compensation looks like. This is where you fall. If you want to get here, this is where you need to go. These are the skills that you need to attain. This is what we want to see from you. Oh, also, did you see here in our policy, if you're on corrective action, you're not going to get a promotion. So if you don't want to be on corrective action, maybe you should start coming to work on time. Maybe you should start doing those things so that people know where they fit and where they fall in the system and what they can do to get into a better area. So that's even more incentive for people to do more or do better or work harder or whatever the case may be. But it provides a lot more reliability and I think stability too for employees and employers.
Yes, and we know that we want to be able to recruit the best and retain the best people in our workplaces in South Carolina, and being able to show that you're paying folks fairly and well, I think is one of those baseline things that employers need to be able to do and show that they're doing well. We could talk about this all day. You are such a wealth of knowledge on this topic, and it really is a fascinating and important topic of discussion. How can people get in touch with you, Sheila, if they want to find out more about the current law in South Carolina, and if they're an employer, how they might be able to get more of your expertise?
Oh, absolutely. So my email address is swillis, so Sheila Willis, just swillis@fisherphillips.com. If you go to our pay equity map, it's actually on our firm's website, so you can look me up. I'm in the W's for Willis. And happy to talk with employers if you guys have any questions or anything. Like I said, I kind of nerd out on some of this stuff because it is a unique convergence of a lot of different things when you think about pay inequities and what happens. And I will say, I know you were talking about pay equity or equal pay day at the top of the hour, and this is the average day, right? If you go later into the year, we get the equal pay days for those other protected classes that you mentioned that have the lower rates. And so when you think about, I think Latino women's equal pay day is sometime in the fall, in September. So when you think about having to work almost a full year to earn, that's some scary, angry stuff.
Amen. You're absolutely right. And when we think about the how that affects a woman's lifetime earnings, it's profound. So we're talking about, for Black women and Latina women in South Carolina, it's hundreds of thousands of dollars of lost income over their lifetime. So it's not just a matter of that time of that year, but how that adds up over time takes a tremendous toll. If you follow WREN's social media accounts, you can see this great display that some of our advocates are doing, showing the checks that they're owed from South Carolina for those lost wages over a lifetime. Another way of calling attention to this issue that needs much more attention. Tomorrow is Equal Pay Day. It's that average day in the year that we recognize on the whole that women would have had to earn to make what men had earned in the previous year. And we've got a whole week of events. Tomorrow evening at 6:00 on Facebook Live, we'll be talking about new pay equity legislation. So a lot of the tenets that Sheila described to us about pay equity law in other states, we have a really strong piece of legislation, bipartisan legislation that's been introduced in the House and the Senate. And tomorrow evening, my colleague Ashley Lita will be talking to Representative Wendy Brawley, who's the lead sponsor of this bill in the House, about that piece of legislation and why it's so crucial for us to move forward in adopting that legislation now. You can sign a petition in support of equal pay legislation. That petition will be linked in our comments below. If you are an employer who wants to sign on to a letter of support for that legislation, there's also an option for you to do that. And we also want to make sure that you have a resource that you can use. A lot of the points that Sheila brought up today, not in as much depth that she was able to discuss today, but we do have a resource on our website that is called Power Up, Closing the Gender and Racial Pay Gap in South Carolina. That this is for employers to give you some tips about how to begin to address pay gaps in your workplace and some of the reasons why you should consider doing so. So we invite you to be part of this conversation with us all week and then beyond, because this is a topic that isn't going away anytime soon, but we can make progress on it if we all commit to doing so as advocates, as decision makers, as employers, as community members, that we can close the pay gap. So thank you so much to South Carolina Women Lawyers Association, an awesome collaborator in this event that we've had today. We appreciate your work on this topic, and a huge thank you to Sheila Willis. Thank you for giving your time and your expertise to our network. And thank you to all of you who have joined us today, and we hope you'll take action and stay with us and help us close the pay gap. That's it for WREN for today, and we'll see you. We'll see you in our other events throughout the week. Thanks, folks. Thank you, Sheila.
You're welcome. Thanks.